This is a Christian lecture, and that word Christian for many people conjures up the most beautiful and warm feelings there are, and for other people it feels like it's just related to judgment and sin and damnation, and they just run away from it. But I wanted to tell you a bit about what I think it means to be a Christian, or to follow a Christian path. Of course, when we think of something being Christian, it comes from the life of Jesus. And Jesus, for me, is defined by his unlimited, universal, for all people, unboxed love. And you think about it, wherever Jesus' medical field, wherever the culture of his time, wherever his own religion said, love is here, but it's not there, it doesn't belong to them, he seemed to have to break out of that box to show that love is universal. It's for all people. This unity of being, feeling connected, feeling loved, is for everyone. Just think of it, right where his culture was saying, oh, it's good to love, but don't go love those tax collectors who are ripping us off. What did he do? He went to those tax collectors. He loved them. Some of them became his disciples. Same thing with prostitutes. People were saying, don't go hang out with them, you'll lose your reputation. He did the same thing, transformed them inside and out. Right where the medical field of his day was saying, it's good to love, but don't go out and love the lepers. They're contagious. God must not like them. What did he do? He went to those lepers, and his sense of divine love, divine health, uplifted these individuals. He healed some of them, and he didn't contract their disease. And right where his own culture, the Jews of his day, were saying, oh, it's good to love, and we know how to love, but they were criticizing other religious faiths, like the Samaritans. They felt like they had everything upside down, kind of the half-Jews, who were very conservative. Well, what did he do? He goes and tells a parable to his disciples how a Samaritan can express love better than even a high-standing Jew. What was he doing there? He was showing that it's not about the label that we seem to have on the surface, Christian, Buddhist, Sufist, whatever we seem to be, whatever we're calling ourselves. It's about understanding that each and every one of us deserve to feel love, understand that we each live to express love, and that there's a way to feel our unity with love in such a way that really brings healing to relationships, healing to our body, healing in every aspect of our life. And that's what I want to talk about, this universal love. That's why I call myself a Christian, because I think more than anyone who ever lived, Jesus really understood love. Now, when I was in college, I started to ask myself all the big questions about why we're here in life and how we can do the most good, and I was kind of getting my boots dirty. I was interested in politics and in the environment and all sorts of things that I thought could help the world. But I couldn't get rid of these bigger questions I had in the back of my mind about why are we actually here? Is there a God? Is there the divine? And if so, how do we get in tune with it? And I started to study what's called perennial religion or perennial philosophy. And it was, in a sense, a search for real love. It was a search for the divine. It was a search for finding a real sense of belonging. And I started to read one book after the next from saints and yogis and sages who had claimed to experience God or the divine. And I was just eating one up after the next, both within an academic context and in my own free time. I was really on a search for what is universally true. And even though I read so many books and I was kind of cherry-picking from different traditions and teachers, there was one book that I read that totally changed the course of my life. And it's called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by a remarkable woman named Mary Baker Eddy. And she had claimed to discover Christian science, which is to say that there is a universal knowledge, a science, so to speak, of Christianity. Now, the Christ, that divine element that Jesus expressed, was not his physicality. In fact, we just know zero about what he looked like. People didn't walk away saying, oh, he was 6 feet tall with blue eyes and had this kind of personality. No, they walked away feeling God, feeling love. And his divine mentality eclipsed physicality or physique. And the Christ, that divine element within him, was his mentality, was the godliness which he understood and expressed. And the Bible invites us to have that same mind that was in Christ Jesus, that same mentality. And Mary Baker Eddy found that she had discovered the science, the know-how, the laws that underpin that kind of divine consciousness, that anyone can have that same consciousness which Jesus had, that blessed and healed and reunited people with that native sense of love. Well, as I was starting to read this book, Science and Health, wonderful things started to happen to me. At the time, I was doing personal care work for a woman who was chronically ill, and she had tried everything to get better. She had exhausted the medical field, tried all sorts of alternative therapies, and nothing seemed to work. And when I started to share this book with her and the understanding within, she quickly started to recover. Within a few months, she was up out of her bed, taking dance classes, taking art classes, whole new lease on life. Now, I lost my job, but I started to find this new vocation in life, helping people through prayer. And there were quite a few other healings at the time. My dad, who was an alcoholic growing up, I started to share with him, started to see him differently. One day, he had lost all desire for that alcohol, and from that moment on, he was my biggest supporter in my pursuit of spiritual things. I had a difficulty with my shoulder for many years. I had to stop playing sports when I was a kid. But as I was reading this book, all the pain that had lingered for so many years from this issue seemed just to dissipate and disappear altogether. Now, a lot of people don't always feel loved moment to moment, a real sense of unity and completeness. In fact, in our world, many people feel like when they turn on the news, all they hear is divisiveness and division and discord. And often people seem to be pitted against each other. You know, this race versus this race, this sex versus this sex, this political or social view versus this political or social view. But within the Christian teachings that I follow, I found that there is a way to find our unity, not only with ourselves and God, but with each other. Now, the way that Jesus reunited individuals with a sense of unity and love and health was through this process he called prayer. And a lot of people today, when they use this word prayer, they're using it in very namby-pamby, wimpy ways. But when I use this word, I'm talking about the most powerful, influential activity that we could ever involve ourselves in. I'm talking about that which can lift us above the sod of materialism and connect us with everything that's holy and true and eternal and absolutely good. Now, there's this ubiquitous image for prayer that people have all around the world. You ask a little child to draw what it looks like to pray, and they'll draw this symbol. What will they draw? Yeah, hands together. What position? Are they standing up? Yeah, down on one's knees. It's amazing how universal this image is. There's, of course, variations. But there's something so intuitive about it, and for me, it really does point to the heart of what prayer is. What does it mean to be down on our knees? Yeah, humility. What did Jesus say? I can of my own self do some things, but when it gets really tough, I go to God? No, he said, I can of my own self do nothing. It certainly seemed like he was doing things, right? He was talking, he was eating, he was walking around. But what I think he meant there was that he couldn't create anything that is eternally true. For something to be eternal, it means that it doesn't come and go. It's not born and it doesn't die. It's like the numbers. You know, you take the number 1 or 2, it didn't go through a process of evolution to become what it is, right? It wasn't a survival of the fittest scenario where each number was fighting for its place. Each number just eternally is. And we have different symbols for numbers. You know, you take the number 1, you can call it uno in Spanish, or un in French, y in Mandarin. We have all these different sounds and symbols for it, but they're pointing to an eternal idea, aren't they? Number 1 is an idea. It's not a material object. You could draw 1 on the board and erase it, but it wouldn't erase the concept, and we would be fine with that. But if you take a different number, say a very odd, unusual number, 2,632,000, if you all of a sudden erase that from reality, every banking system in the world would just collapse, right? If you took it out of reality. Every number is needed. It has its place. Well, I think each and every one of us, the representations of us change over the years. Our bodies change over the years, right? When we're 4 years old and 30 years old, every cell in our body could probably be different. We can have a very different personality, but there's that same us there, isn't there? We would experience us in a similar way. We think about ourselves as four as being the same person. You meet somebody at a different stage in their life, and you sense that they're the same person, don't you? Even though the cover often seems different, the representation seems different. Well, what about putting our hands together in prayer? What's this all about? No wrong answers here.
Being still.
Being still, okay. Sense of unifying. Yes. Yeah, Jesus didn't say, I and my Father are two, but when I pray, we're relatively close. He said, I and my Father are one. And again, this sense of oneness, so important for efficacious prayer. So we have that humility, putting something greater than ourselves before us that creates eternal ideas that an individual can never do. We have that sense of being at one with God, with divine love, the principle of existence. And then there's a closing of one's eyes. What's this getting at? Not being distracted. Yeah, you can't be tweeting when you have your eyes closed. Going into the closet. Yeah, and Jesus was out in the wilderness most of the time, wasn't he? There weren't a lot of closets around. So he was clearly talking about a mental space free from the limitations of our material senses. And as we'll see in this lecture, there's reason not only to reject our physical sense of life because it's limited, but it often shows us the exact opposite of what's really going on. Okay, so the very first line of this book, Science and Health, it gives the thesis or linchpin for the entire work. And it says, the prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of Him, and unselfed love. And this can sound quite daunting at first. How do you have an absolute faith? How can you really understand God in a way that makes a difference? And how can you love without that feeling like I'm just trying to get something out of this? You know, it's a quid pro quo deal. You know, I'll love you as long as I'm getting love back, but if I don't get it, I'm out of here. Well, we're going to unpack this and explore these concepts, which are right at the heart of this book, Science and Health, right at the heart of Christian Science. Understanding that one can have a faith that's not blind. One can really understand God in a way that's more real than any image that we see to our physical senses. And we can actually love in a way that's universal, like Jesus did, in a way that's scientific, demonstrable. So there's this wonderful definition of faith in the Bible. It says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. These are very scientific terms, substance, evidence. Now, how can you have evidence for something if you can't see it to the material eye? There's a little analogy that I like to think about how the earth is a sphere, isn't it? And yet that's not how we normally see it. We know that this is true now, but for most of the time in our life as we're walking around, it looks like we're on a very flat earth. And many people believe that throughout history, that the earth was flat. But how do we know that it's a sphere now? Seen it from a bigger perspective, haven't we? We've gone up higher. And if you trace the steps of how we got there, first someone through the field of science, and science in all its iterations, you could say, is a search for the eternal, that which is fundamentally true, that which doesn't just change or is temporal or is for a certain class of people. It's something that's totally universal. And through these universal disciplines, astronomy and mathematics, people started to discover that the earth appears like a sphere. And lion-hearted men jumped in boats, traveled all the way around the world, came back to the same spot. They said, I've got my testimony to tell. But not everybody believed him at first. Just like when some people have full circle healings spiritually, not everybody believes their testimony at first. And in recent history, astronauts have been able to go way out to outer space and from the big perspective actually see the Earth for what it is. Does that make sense? And in that process, you're not changing a flat Earth by going up higher to see that it's a sphere. You're just viewing it from the correct perspective, right? Just like if I went up to you really close and I was just looking at your arm and I thought you were an arm, I need to step back a ways, right? To get the full picture, to see who you really are. Well, I think often in life, we're looking at life in this very myopic, personal, limited way. And it's often showing life as fallen flat, as divided, as discontent, as finite, as inclusive of dis-ease. And I think what Jesus was doing is he was lifting up his mentality to God, looking at things from God's point of view, the point of view of the eternal mind, you could say, of divine love itself. And from that viewpoint, he saw wholeness and health and peace and love. And he carried with him those qualities of being that he knew were from God, that were eternal, that were just baked into life. And that higher state of consciousness, he lifted people up to it, where they started to experience that health and joy and peace right away. And as we lift up ourselves to the view from God, the eternal mind, we can start to experience harmony in a way that is impossible through any other method. And when I was in college and I started to experience all these wonderful healings through reading this book, I wanted to bring my academic studies in consonance with what I was learning practically through prayer. And so I decided to go to this island of Kauai, Hawaii, and do a year-long documentary about miracles. And when I went there, I really was just collecting these amazing miracle stories every day, and I started to have my own fair share of them. And one day, I went to do this hike. It's an 11-mile trek along this beautiful ridgeline on the island of Kauai. And I was a mile and a half into this hike, and my sandals broke. And I realized I was between a rock and a hard place, because I couldn't hike backwards. Someone had dropped me off at the trailhead. There would just be nowhere to go once I got back to the starting point. And I was young and foolhardy, and I thought, you know what, I think I could just go for it barefoot. And about halfway through that hike, I realized that was a bad choice. Not only did my feet get cracked and burnt, they started to bleed, and I had a 30-pound or 40-pound backpack on. And at that point, I really started to reach out to God. And I started to think about something I had been reading. And, you know, Jesus, he said, you can pray for anything. And if you have this thing called faith, you will receive it. And I started to think that faith is more than just a blind trust. It's really about that view, that eternal view, that health and joy and peace and feeling loved and complete. These are something that are just baked into reality. This is what we get when we start thinking out from God. It's not something that comes from a favorable material condition. It's actually a divine mindset. And as I started to hike along, I started to think about all the wonderful stories in the Bible I've read about how people had absolute faith in times of difficulty. And before I knew it, I was able to finish that hike, end on a beautiful white sand beach. And I started to think about an analogy I learned on island about faith. It's related to floating. Often in the early morning hours, I would go out to the beach, and so peacefully I would see people just floating on the ocean as a kind of meditative practice. And whenever I tried to do it, I would just sink like a lead weight. But I started to realize there's a lot of salient lessons about how faith relates to floating. What makes a good floater? Buoyancy. What else? Yeah, trust. And relaxation, yes. The Bible says, be still and know that I am God. That's a form of faith, consciously stilling the human mind. Human mind never creates anything eternally true, never creates anything lastingly true. And it's about stilling one's mind, one's repetitious thoughts, and really listening to God. Someone said buoyancy. You could say that there's a law of buoyancy available for everyone 24/7, but for it to work in your favor, you need to completely lean on it. Does that make sense? And you can't just go 90% in, you'll still sink. You really got to go all in. Does that make sense? Does anyone know a quote about leaning out there? Yes. The Bible talks about leaning not on our own understanding. In this book, Science and Health talks about those leaning on the sustaining infinite, an allusion to God. Today is big with blessings. A couple other points here. It helps to keep your face upwards, doesn't it, when you're floating? Your vision upwards. It doesn't help to look down at the bodily condition. How's this arm doing? How's that leg doing? You're going to lose your equilibrium. Harder to float that way. And probably most importantly of all, you really need to open up. So often in life, we feel like we're in this little echo chamber of our own mentality. We often feel trapped in just hearing our own thoughts reverberate back to us, like we're in a reverberation chamber. And those thoughts that I'm not good enough, or that, what did this person say about me? Why did they say it? Why did they say it? Why did they say it? Or why did I say this thing? Why did I say it, right? You hear these thoughts coming back to you again and again. But in prayer, you really need to not only just open up a little bit to let those thoughts start to trickle out, you really have to totally open up. Prayer is really about opening up to God, the great I Am, which is always pouring forth good, beautiful, strong, divine, eternal ideas. And as I was lying on that beach that day, I felt a sense of just really opening up to the divine, really opening up to God. And as I was lying there, I found my arms just opening up in deference to God. And you know what? They hit something. And I kind of grabbed it, put it in front of my face, and guess what it was? It was a bright blue sandal on that tan sand beach. And I reached over again, and there was another one there. And I kind of just grabbed it as I was lying supine there on the sand, and I put it up to my eyes, and I said, what do you know? And I put them on my feet. Guess what? Perfect fit. Not a size too big, not a size too small. And when that happened, it wasn't like some apocalypse movie when the skies open up and everything changes. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. It felt like I was just deeply loved. And I think that each one of us has a life that's fitted just for us. And that abundance and supply and goodness, that just are qualities of God. They're ever present. And I don't think my prayer that day was actually changing anything at all. It wasn't changing a space where there was no shoe there to all of a sudden a shoe being there. It was more just waking me up. It was waking me to a life that was fitted for me, that was always there. And sometimes when I tell stories like this, the words and the explanation are good, but fortunately today we also have some beautiful musicians who can help bring this idea of faith to life.
Like the trees that never plead for water, that just stand with branches open wide. We receive the Father's rain of blessing. When we trust, He will provide. Like the fish living underwater, they can't trip or tumble or fall down. We live in our element of spirit. Our support is all around. Like the birds high above
When you think about the Judeo-Christian tradition, it comes from this basic thesis that there's one power to life, and that it makes everything in its own image, and that it's altogether good. And I think that the biggest, most sublime question we could ever ask is, what is God? What is the source of everything? And for the author of this book, Science and Health, this was the biggest and most important inquiry in her life. Mary Baker Eddy wrote in Science and Health that God is incorporeal, divine, supreme, infinite mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love. And I think these 7 terms, she wasn't trying just to shoehorn the infinite into these little finite terms. And if you say, oh, I believe in this, then I'm a Christian Scientist, or I'm a Christian. No, not at all. I think she was trying to show 7 perfect angles to view the divine that would really bring out the fullness of the great I Am, the Creator. And sometimes when people think about worshiping God, they think, oh, if I just become very saintly or very godlike, I'm going to lose my individuality. But this is the exact opposite of what we experience within the practice of Christian Science. Knowing our Creator makes creativity flow through us more naturally. We awaken to our innate creativity. Knowing our origin, we find that we're original. We find originality in life. Knowing our author makes us more authoritative, more confident. We feel dominion in life. And Mary Baker Eddy, she lived in a time before women could even vote in America, before women were accepted in the pulpit, and she also talked about God as Father, Mother, as a hyphenated term. She really brought out the feminine nature of God, really brought out an equality, a full equality to the sexes, and so that's something we should fight for. She was very much before her time along those lines. But you know what? She lifted up the conversation even higher, above gender altogether, to really see that God is life itself, a life that we can describe as love. And love, it's a living principle. It's something we can reason out from. Prime comes from the same root as principle, meaning something that's irreducible, something that's fundamental. It can't be explained in terms of anything else. Just like a prime number, it can't be explained in terms of any other number. Soul, another way to talk about God, the source of all beauty and bounty and creativity. Spirit, meaning the essence of something, non-contained, not contained by time or space. And mind, as you can see, a word that I love for God. And we could think about God's allness and talk about it all night long. It would be an amazing lecture, I think. But I think a lot of people have this feeling when you're starting to talk about God's allness is right away is just, well, what about all the bad stuff? Why do bad things happen to good people and all that? And Mary Baker Eddy approaches this in part by saying, it is our ignorance of God, the divine principle, which produces apparent discord, and the right understanding of Him restores harmony. I don't know about you, but sometimes I find it's my ignorance of God that's producing the discord. But either way, the gospel of Christian Science, the good news here, is that a right understanding of God, of life, the right view of life, brings out harmony and its wholeness, its completeness, its unity, its love, right here and now. And to substantiate that idea, I just want to share with you a couple of quick healings from a friend of mine. You know, some years ago, I was looking for an apartment in a town, and my friend was looking for an apartment in the same town, and we didn't even know we were in the same town together. And we were really struggling to find a place that we could afford and we liked. And it turns out, in the end, we ended up renting apartments, sharing a balcony right next to each other. And we were so delighted. And my friend was going through a tough time. I was going through a tough time. We were both breaking up with girlfriends we had dated for many years. I said, you know what? Why don't you go and just tell her how you feel? Maybe you guys can work things out. And he said, you know what I think I should actually do is read that book that you gave me, Science and Health. He said, I think the answers are in there. And he started to get his nose into this book. and he started to read it. And what happened to him was something that was quite beautiful. He started to discover a sense of love that was untethered from any human being. He started to find a love that was just life itself, and that he lived to express. And he started to carry with him that sense of love wherever he went. And he started to discover that love, unlike material things, the more you give it away, the more that you seem to have of it, right? If I had $5 in my back pocket and gave one away to you and one away to you and one away to you, eventually I'd be out of money, right? But if I start loving individuals, the more I do it, the more I realize that I have it, and that love is everywhere, and it's not bounded by space or time. Same thing with truth, any aspect of God. The more you're true and honest to people, the more that you find that truth is everywhere. The truth is the basis of life and good relationships. Well, my friend, we ended up living together in a different city a couple years after that. He was in a very horrific car accident. I won't go into it now, but we prayed about this together, and within a few days, he was back at his job like nothing ever happened. It was such an amazing transformation. For him, it was just this wonderful healing he could put in his back pocket and pull out at any moment to say that Christian Science is efficacious, even in the most difficult of times. He called me a few years after that, and he said, "Nate, can we pray about teeth? Is that something that's fair game?" And I said, "Yeah, of course. You can pray about anything. Anything within consciousness. As you get a bigger view of it, you'll start to experience it more godly, more right, more harmoniously." And, even though he had this tooth issue, I think that there was more going on there. I think he really wanted what you could call the ancillary effects of prayer. As opposed to a material remedy in life, material remedies, when you try to fix things in one area, they often alter something else in our life negatively. It's like, you push one side and the other side goes up. You ever see those commercials for drugs, and they'll say, it'll do all these good things for you, but then at the very end it will say, and might cause, and then all this bad stuff. But prayer, for me, it's uplifting consciousness. And I live on the coast in Maine, and if you try to take one boat 8 feet out of the water, it's very hard with human will or human effort. We do it at the end of the year. But when the tides come up, every boat in the river naturally comes up. Not even one boat stays down underwater 8 feet. They all come up. Does that make sense? And when we lift our consciousness to God, we start to see everything in our life, our relationships, everything, the functions of our body and of our work lives, everything. It says in Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to them that love God. And I feel like my friend, even though he had this tooth issue, what was really behind that, his desire to pray there, was he wanted to feel that sense of total love in his life, that completeness. I'll read to you what he wrote about this experience. He said, "I had been going to the dentist for years and was told each time that I needed a root canal because my tooth was dead and discolored. The only other option was to have it pulled. And he told me that the dentist gave him an ultimatum. He said that this had been going on too long. They had the x-rays. This seemed to be causing problems in his mouth, and he had to take care of it. And in this particular instance, as we started to understand him as the expression of God, we started to realize that that was correlated with his substance. I don't know if you've ever realized, but those two words perfectly correlated. They're really saying the same thing, understanding, and that substance of things hoped for. Understanding, substance. They're both about what is our foundation. What are we standing on mentally? Jesus, he gives his, you could say, greatest hits in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And at the end of those, he said, if you build your life on my teachings, it's like building your house on the rock. When the storms of life come, essentially, your house, your consciousness, your life, it will not be knocked over. And to understand God, that becomes the substance of our life. What we really understand becomes the substance of our life. And Mary Baker Eddy in Science and Health talked about substance being eternal and incapable of decay. Everything that is truly substantial is eternal. It comes from God. And there's this analogy that Jesus used. Remember them singing about, Lola and Jacob singing about shining like the sun? Well, there's this analogy that I like to think about with a light beam. And if you saw a light beam shine out from a window, and you said to that light beam, "Hey man, you're no good, you're too bright, you got a bad tooth," it wouldn't change the light beam at all, would it? No. What if you walked up to that light beam, tried to physically manipulate it, tried to pull things out of it? Would it stop it from shining? No. What if you tried to put that light beam into a box and bring it into the other room? Open up that box, start to study the light beam. Would it be in there? No. But the truth is, the way we define ourselves moment to moment in life actually is through these means. We often define ourselves by what we've said to people, what people have said about us. We often define ourselves by what has physically occurred in our life or what has happened to us a moment ago. And we often define ourselves by how the world has tried to box us in as this age, this race, in this part of town, with these proclivities. But if Jesus is right, these are not the means by which we should define ourselves. What defines that light beam? Its source, the sun. How many sources does it have? Just one. Oneness. One source. And you could say, without going into the physics of it, that one sun creates out of its very own being, as its own expression, brand new every moment, those rays or beams. Does that make sense? And if you put your hand up to that light beam for as long as you want, the second you take it down, that light is shining because it's brand new every moment. And as I was praying with my friend about his tooth, we started to realize that he was the expression of God, brand new every moment, eternally new. And he was the expression of what? Eternal life. For something to be eternal, it means that it can't decay. It doesn't change. Like the numbers don't decay over time, right? They're eternal, permanent ideas. And that he was a beautiful, permanent idea of God. And that there could be nothing within him that decays or dies or is imperfect. Jesus said, "Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." That's kind of like the law of expression. Well, as we're praying about this, we really felt a sense of his oneness with God, and that he was not defined by what people had said about him. The doctors had made x-rays. He was not defined by any material image. You would call that an idol in biblical terms. But no, he was the image of God, something wholly perfect and good. And just to give you a sense of what we felt that night, I'm going to invite Lola and Jacob back up on stage, and they're going to sing a beautiful song about identity, about spiritual identity.
Innocent and pure,
Well, when my friend who had that tooth issue, after we prayed about it and we felt that freedom that was just voiced in song so beautifully, this is what happened next. He went back to that dentist the next day and he said, the day after we spoke and prayed about it, I went into the dentist and he and all the nurses were baffled. They looked at the x-ray from before and the ones taken that day. They looked in my mouth. They said that that tooth looked perfectly healthy and I was fine. Nothing further was needed. They said that they had never seen anything like it before in all their years of dentistry. Isn't that nice? But you know what? You take those $10 sandals that I found on the beach, you take this perfect tooth, that's not what's really substantial here, just a tooth or a cheap pair of sandals. What's substantial is that love and that wholeness and that spiritual identity that were understood in these accounts of healing. That's what was substantial. Remember, what's substantial is akin to our understanding of God. What's truly substantial is God. And when I was thinking about how to make a difference when I was in college and how to love, I started to really dive into Jesus' teachings anew when I started reading Science and Health. And Jesus said that greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. He really lived a life that could be the perfect embodiment of self-sacrifice. And when you walk into most churches these days, you see this symbol of his life in the back. It's a symbol of him up on the cross, right? And I love that symbol in that it brings me that sense of appreciation and gratitude for everything that Jesus did for everyday people like me. But the thing is that Jesus didn't just sacrifice and die. In fact, there were a lot of people who have died upon crosses. There were two right next to him that day. A lot of people have lived wonderful self-sacrificial lives. But if what made Jesus unique was not the cross, what was it? Yes, the resurrection. It's that he didn't really die on the cross, right? And that he proved it. We can talk about life being eternal hypothetically, but he really proved it. When his disciples witnessed his death, like many people when they witness death, even in very normal circumstances, they become very forlorn, and it just seems like life is dark and gloomy. Yet his disciples felt the same way. They went back to their old jobs. They didn't continue his mission after he passed on. They just went back to fishing, right? And then when Jesus started to show up to them as he promised he would, that changed all of human history, didn't it? Everything was different from that point on. Imagine someone showed up today, they made such a difference that we said, you know what, we're going to turn the calendars back to zero. Everything is new now. That's what we did with Jesus. Everything is new. History back to zero. And when I think of Jesus, I really think of that deathless life, that eternal love, something that just is. It doesn't come and go. It's not on the human cycle. Now, we often see life in terms of cycles. Just like we talk about the sun, a sunrise. We talk about a sun rising to high noon. We talk about a sun setting, and then we see a sun no more. It kind of mirrors the human life cycle, doesn't it? Someone being born, maturing, growing up, and then often, eventually, passing on. Yet to that light beam, does that light beam ever stop shining? Did the sun ever stop shining? No. It's always just shining, and it's not conscious of those cycles that we see humanly. That's only the human perspective, isn't it? Well, Jesus, always lifting himself up in prayer, always looked at life out from that eternal perspective, I believe. And when I was young, I went to a variety of Christian churches. My mom was kind of church shopping, and I went to a lot of churches that I just loved, and I loved the way they talked about Jesus, but I never really felt like I could do what he was doing. Sometimes I would hear that verse in the Bible about Jesus said we could do the things that he did and even greater, and I thought, not me. And that all changed when I started to read the writings of Mary Baker Eddy. She really understood that there is this universal knowledge, this science of the Christ that anyone can apply and demonstrate. And instead of working up to being spiritual or whole or loved or seeing ourselves as the image of God, she started there. She told everyone through her writings that we are spiritual because God is spirit. That's just fact. We don't become spiritual after a lot of study and hard work or reading the Bible cover to cover a bunch of times. It's just a fundamental truth, just like the earth is a sphere, even though it doesn't appear to us always from our earthly perspective. And the thing that really inspires me about Mary Baker Eddy is that she really understood the pitfalls of personality. If you study world religion to any degree, if you study the saints and sages and yogis throughout the ages who have claimed to experience God firsthand, you'll quickly see that many people throughout history have had a healing effect on others. Many people have intuitively understood something about the unity of being or divine love, and often they've had a healing experience. I recently saw a documentary on Netflix about one particular guru who really seemed to be wonderfully charismatic, and when people were in their presence, they seemed to be uplifted mentally and physically. And people started to do terrible things to be in the presence of this individual, even break the law. They just wanted to get near them. And there's a problem with that. Mary Baker Eddy really had the exact opposite effect on people. She constantly pushed people outside of that view of personality or a human individual being the source of truth or infinite eternal love. And she lifted them up to see life from God's point of view, and that they had a direct connection to God. They didn't have to go to any special pastor or priest or holy person to get that connection. It was always theirs. And, you know, if we just up the ante for a second, imagine if Jesus was up here instead of me today. Every seat would be filled. There'd be a big line out the door, just waiting, clamoring to get in. And if you waited in that line long enough, maybe you'd get to the front and you get to have your few minutes with Jesus, probably best moments of your life. But then you'd go home and you'd start to feel, oh man, just if I could be in his presence again. I forgot to ask this question, right? But imagine if one day we discovered the science of the mentality of Jesus, that you could have that same mind that was in Christ Jesus. You didn't need to rely on him as a human being. That would be a huge breakthrough, because there's a lot of limitations with human beings. They can't always be with us. In fact, I've never met Jesus as a human being. I've only learned about the Christ through the Bible. You know, you could say the same thing about the wonderful music that we're hearing tonight. Imagine if we knew nothing about the science of music, and we were just addicted to these amazing musicians. And then one day someone said, you know what, there's a science of music. There are eternal relationships between the notes. Any one of us can study that science of music. Once we really get it, it will always be with us. We could read sheet music, play any song in the world. That would be a huge, amazing day, right? When the science of music was discovered. I think this is how Mary Baker Eddy felt when she uncovered the science of Christ. Now, she had become one of the most successful, if not the most successful, spiritual healer of the modern age. Many wonderful biographies written about her. This one is one of my favorites, called Christian Healer. Catalogs over 300 healing experiences that came about through her prayers. It was recorded that she healed people who were blind, crippled, deaf. She revived plants in a dark room with no light. She did all sorts of amazing and unusual things through her prayers that seemed impossible to a human vantage point. But she didn't want to be known just as a personal healer, as someone with this incredible portfolio. She wasn't just trying to check off every disease and make herself famous for being a personal healer. No, in fact, she wanted to be known as the discoverer of Christian Science, and not as just a mere personal spiritual healer. And this today is how she is known throughout the world, as the discoverer of Christian Science. And I want to tell you one story about a woman who met her that for me really instantiates this whole idea about getting beyond personality and lifting people up to be able to heal like Jesus healed. There was a woman named Harriet O'Brien who lived during Mary Baker Eddy's age. Mary Baker Eddy, parenthetically, lived from 1821 until 1910. And this woman, Harriet O'Brien, she had a long, difficult search for health. She was diagnosed with chronic back issues and chronic heart issues, and she became so ill, she stopped speaking. She really had a tough go at life, and she had one surgery that went awry, and she picked up what's called an iatrogenic ailment, something caused by medical intervention, and she was relegated to a wheelchair. And she had become so sick that they had people watching her around the clock thinking that she could pass on at any moment. And it was at this point that she was introduced to a woman who was taught by Mary Baker Eddy how to heal through prayer. And this individual who started to pray for this person started to find good results. And this woman, Harriet O'Brien, very quickly started to recover her health. So quickly that she started to think, you know what, maybe I can even walk again. Eventually, it didn't come quickly, but week after week, month after month, she prayed with that practitioner, and she eventually got up out of that wheelchair, started walking normally. Well, after that happened, as you could imagine, she said, I want to meet Mary Baker Eddy, what seems to be the source of all this goodness, the woman who wrote this book, the woman who taught that person who healed me. And she was able to go to her home outside of Boston at the time and meet Mary Baker Eddy just briefly. And this is what she wrote about this experience. She said, transparency is the word that best expresses my impression of Mrs. Eddy. Instinctively, I felt her great love, and I was conscious that no one I had ever seen loved me as much as she did. My entire thought was filled with a spiritual illumination, and there was a glory in the sunshine and landscape as though a breath of heaven had swept earth and enveloped me. Sounds like a good day, huh? Now, if I was her, I would have said, I know where I'm going to be tomorrow morning. I'm going to get another dose of that Mary Baker Eddy. But that's not the effect she had on others. In fact, this woman, Harriet O'Brien, said she had a question in her heart at the time, and the question was, can I be a healer too? And she said the moment she met Mary Baker Eddy, without even any words being exchanged, she said that question was answered. She shortly jumped on a train, went back to her home in Kansas City, and opened a public office as a practitioner of Christian Science. She advertised in what's called the Christian Science Journal for over 50 years. And she left a long record of healing, including several instances where she said she healed people who were apparently dying on their deathbed of some difficult disease, and she raised them to a life of health. Isn't that nice? Well, I want to share with you one last story today about unselfed love. You know, often in life we feel this, obsession with that me thinking. What am I going to order on Amazon today? What am I going to do to better my life and my lot? And yet, to be that light of the world, we need to begin to see what God is and what we are as God's expression. And we're meant to light up the dark places in life. And I was praying at this time in my life about how to get outside of self, how to get off that hamster wheel of that me thinking, how to really shine my light onto others. And that desire really being a form of prayer, that desire led me to a place that had people who seemed very different than myself on the surface, people I might not be friends with in everyday life. And that was a jail near where I was living in Boston. And one day when I went to this jail to share Christian Science with the folks in there, I was all prayed up and I was expecting a big crowd like tonight, and only 2 people showed up. And at first I was quite disappointed, but then I looked into the hearts of these 2 young men, and they really had this incredible mentality. It was as if they were saying, I've exhausted the material outlook on life. Boy, it's promised a lot, but it has delivered little. Look where it landed me. Now, if God is real, I'm ready. Just tell me, and I'll do it. And yet, they were so receptive and ready to be obedient to what is right and good, yet they weren't buying what I was sharing. I was reading them what's called the Christian Science Bible lesson that has citations from the Bible and then related passages from science and health that help bring out the spiritual meaning, help uplift us to see the spiritual view more clearly. And as I was reading these passages to them, they were saying, Nate, I'm not some image and likeness of divine love, some perfect manifestation of truth. I don't know if you know me, but I'm a bad guy. I've done horrible things in my life, irredeemable things. My father, same story. Grandfather, same story. I think it's just in my blood. Well, fortunately, I had a story to tell him about how I was once diagnosed with a chronic blood issue and was healed through Christian Science prayer. Sometimes I tell it in this lecture, but today you got some different healings. But more importantly than that healing was that we talked about that light beam analogy, which I shared with you moments ago. And I told that man, you do not have to define yourself by what people have said about you, by what has materially happened in your life, and especially by how the world has tried to box you in as this race from this part of town with this human father. Now, what did Jesus say about fathers? Call no man on earth your father. Was he just anti-family? No. He was talking about a metaphysical principle there, about not defining yourself by individuals, by mortals, by anything that's limited. In Jesus' era, you got everything from your father. Your name, your social status, your job, where you were going to live, what people would think about you. It just all came from your human father. And Jesus was uplifting people to say that you only have one Father, and that's God. You get everything that you are from God, from life itself. And I think he was encouraging people to really understand and love God. Well, as I was talking to this man, we started to unpack what this actually means. If God is love, what is this man? He is loving. That's his nature. If he doesn't act loving, it's going to be wrong, literally wrong, like 2 + 2 = 3. You could see it, but it's not true. If God is principle, then everything is right within him. All things are working together for good. There's a law of order right there. If God is soul, he's soulful. He's a beautiful man, a good man. If God is spirit, he's spiritual right now, defined by God. And as I was speaking to him, you could kind of see a shift going on, as if he had believed his whole life that he was defined by material instances. And now he was starting to look at what it looks like to look at his life from God's point of view. And if he exists to express God's nature, if that's his reason for existing, and that's what really defines him, then maybe his life could be totally different. And you could kind of see this excitement and joy starting to bubble up within him. Well, that day he took a Bible, he took a Science and Health, he went back to his cell, he started to ardently read those books. Fast forward about 6-7 weeks later, I come back to the same prison, same area of the prison. This time there's a big crowd. He must have invited his friends. And he's sitting in the back of this crowd with this beautiful, winsome smile on his face. Totally changed demeanor. Looked like he was on cloud 9. And we got going very quickly, so I couldn't talk to him. But as I was reading this Bible lesson in this informal service, frankly, I just wanted to get it done with because I wanted to talk to that guy in the back. And when we were finally wrapped up, he just sauntered up to me, nice and slow, and he said, "Boy, Nate, I got a testimony for you." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, when I came into this jail, I had been diagnosed with lung cancer." And he said, "The reason why I came to that service is that I heard over the intercom it was a healing service." And he said, "I was in a lot of pain." He said, "You started to share those ideas with me. I started to read those books. Frankly, I don't know what happened, but all the symptoms of that disease just vanished." My buddies were saying, "Oh, it's probably a relapse, probably come back." It didn't. And he said he waited several more weeks, and then he showed up at the service. There he was in front of me, this beautiful paragon, this example, shining example of health, real health, purity, receptivity, humility, joy. It was all there, shining right back at me. And he got kind of quiet at that point, and he said, "Now, do you think this could help me in other areas of my life?" And I said, "Yes, it can." Everything that we've been talking about, love being the foundation of our life, what is really substantial, that love is just what life is. As we start to internalize this, as we allow this to be our understanding, our foundation, then whatever is fallacious, whatever experience seems to be indelible in our past, that seems to define us, but it's not good, whatever is just ugly in consciousness, it comes up to the surface, just like when you add a purity to a chemical solution, all the gunk comes to the top, and you can just wipe it off. And then we can really begin to love in a way that's not constricted by personality or just, I belong to this tribe and so I shouldn't go to that tribe, or, love is here but not there. We've been looking at this analogy of the sun and its rays, and if those rays shine out brand new every moment, when they hit something like the earth, what happens to the earth? It lights up. Not only does it light it up, but it warms it up. Not only does it light it up and warm it up, but it provides opportunities for growth, right? Things are all of a sudden growing and blooming and blossoming. But if those light beams said, "You know what? I don't want to shine today impartially, beautifully, brand new every moment. Just want to kind of hang out in space, reflect upon myself," what would happen? No light, no warmth, just darkness, void, nothingness. But those light beams do not have that option. They have a kismet, they have a destiny, they have a reason for existing, and it's to be the ever-new expression of their source. And if they're shining down and they're going to land on somebody they don't like, they can't just take a left turn the last moment, can they? And head to Paris. No. They have to warm up and light up wherever their source sends them. And that's what it means for me to really love one another, to go where our source sends us. What is God, divine, universal love, asking us to do in this moment? And to really desire to do God's will, to shine in the dark places. It leads us to beautiful places. And to bring that concept of loving one another to light, we're going to hear one more beautiful song tonight from Jacob and Lola and also John.
When you're searching for love, you can look above to really see what truly can be. All that you need to succeed is achieving what you're believing. Look inside your heart from the start. With your soul and your mind, you can find what you're looking for. So open that door. Let all the goodness in. God only knows what's true, what you must do to break through, to discover what you must say. The only way is to love one another. Word of revelation. Love is liberation. Love God, put error at odds. Those who love shall walk with God. God loves you every hour. Love, love, and love.
Wow, oh, wow. Today we've been looking at one sentence. The prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick. It's an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of Him, and unselfed love. And we've been looking at this sentence mostly in relationship to God. How do we have an absolute faith in God, inclusive of understanding and love? But as we do this with God, we can't help but begin to do it with each other. You know, Jesus looked at the Judaic laws that were going around in his culture. People kind of had a checklist. They were checking them each one of them off. And he said, you know what? I'm going to make this a lot easier for you. If you just love God with everything and then love your neighbor or each other as yourself, then all of those laws will naturally be fulfilled. The spirit of them will. And for me, what this means in everyday practice is that we can begin to have an absolute faith in each other. No matter how many times we mess up or show a discordant personality, we can really believe in each other. Just think about Jesus. Who was he resurrecting to? A bunch of nincompoops who had just betrayed him over and over again, right? And yet he believed in these everyday people so much that he came back to them even through death to show them that they could do what he was doing. They could understand themselves spiritually just as he did. They could understand their oneness with God. And so often in life, we just feel caught up in this little loop of the self. It's kind of like if you take a microphone and you try to point it back into the speaker where it's coming out of, and it will feedback, and then it will scream. Have you ever heard that? That's often how we feel, I think, when we feel caught up in this loop of self. But Jesus didn't say, love yourself. He said, love God with everything, and then live those God-like qualities by loving others. Mary Baker Eddy posited it this way. She said, seek your own in another's good. And for one of her last great achievements in life, she started what's called the Christian Science Monitor, an international award-winning newspaper. And in that newspaper, you can see problems in life that seem very divisive, and you can see them bringing out solutions that are really at the heart of the issues that show how we can bring more love and intelligent solutions to the surface, how we can have a sense of unity and care for each other that's not just based upon race or politics, but how we can really get to the root of seeing how we can shine our God-given qualities. Within each and every ray of light, if you put a prism up to it, you'll see that within it, it has every color of light within it. Yeah, have you ever seen that in a prism? And I think that each and every one of us express every quality of God. Each one of us are soulful, we're honest, we're beautiful, we're lovely. And knowing our true nature, knowing the true nature of each other, it can really bring out the biggest blessings in life. It can really bring us outside of this earthly, discordant, illusionary, or elusive nature of division. And just to close here, sometimes I give a lecture like this, and after the whole thing, someone will come up to me and they'll say, well, what words do you actually say when you pray? What words should I say? And for me, it's kind of like saying, what words do you say to your wife to have a perfect relationship? Prayer is about having a relationship with life, with God. And there are some words that are better than others. If I say, I love you, it's going to work better than other words. But if I just say, I love you, and I don't really mean it, it's not going to do anything helpful, right? But what's beyond words there is really having faith in your partner, really understanding them, which takes patience, which takes listening, which takes quality time, and to really love them. That's what creates a good relationship. And the same is true with our relationship with life, with God. When we're really there spending quality time studying about God, learning about the true nature of life. When we really have patience to not just listen to what seems to be going on in our temporal thinking, but to seek out what is eternally true about ourselves and each other, then life can become just fitted just for us. We can see it tangibly. You know, if someone came up to you and they said, I am love itself, but I'm not going to show you, it wouldn't be very loving, right? Love is meant to be experienced, to be felt. And if it's not real. Well, I hope you felt that love today. I hope you experienced it to some degree. I hope you learned something about prayer and healing. If you've never read this book before, I hope you get one. For the online listeners, you can go to christianscience.com, and if you're here in the theater, you can get a discounted copy upstairs. God bless. Thank you to each and every one of you for coming.